Hello, everyone, and welcome to our DC Catholic November Theology on Tap. My name is Molly Herrera, and I'm the Program Director for Campus and Young Adult Ministry for the Archdiocese of Washington. Before we get started, I want to go over a few logistical items. First, welcome to Facebook Live. We had to adjust in the last 30 minutes or so. We're not able to be on YouTube right now, but we will be uploading this broadcast later to YouTube so that you can go back and watch it when you would like. ASL interpretation will be available throughout the night. Thank you, Christina. And as I said, our conversation will be recorded and we'll post it on our social media pages and webpage later for viewing. Finally, I hope you'll share your thoughts on social media with us tonight using hashtag DCTOT and submit questions for our panelists by commenting on our Facebook Live feed. I'm excited to be moderating tonight's panel on It's Okay to Not Be Okay, an honest conversation about mental health during COVID-19. Earlier this year, the COVID-19 pandemic drastically changed our everyday lives in a way we never could have anticipated. And as many of you know, 2020 has not been the easiest year, and thus has made caring for our mental health even more difficult than before. Tonight, I'm honored to be joined by young Catholic leaders who have courageously said yes to having an honest conversation about mental health. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for this evening. Colleen Campbell is the coordinator of formation programs at the Catholic Apostolate Center in Washington, D.C., and a PhD candidate in Catechetics and Religious Education at the Catholic University of America. She is the co-author of The Art of Accompaniment, Theological, Spiritual, and Practical Elements of Building a More Relational Church. Father Nick Rochetka is a member of the Order of Friars Minor Conventual. Father Nick completed his theology at the Catholic University of America in the spring of 2016 and was ordained a priest later that summer. Father Nick is currently the Assistant Director of Formation at the House of Formation for his order in Silver Spring, Maryland. Dr. Helena Orellana is a licensed clinical psychologist, director of the IPS Center for Psychological Sciences, and an adjunct professor for the PsyD program. Her professional interests include the psychological and spiritual impact of trauma, psychodynamic and interpersonal theories, the supervision and training of graduate students, and the integration of a Catholic vision of the person with psychology. So let's dive into our conversation tonight. Dr. Helena, I think it goes without saying that COVID-19 has greatly affected our lives in many different ways. As a clinician, what are 2 or 3 ways that you have seen COVID-19 affect people's lives and their mental health in a way that is different than before the pandemic?
A great question. What it immediately strikes me is that the reality of COVID is a chronic stressor. And those, in some ways, aren't things that we faced in such a large and global scale before COVID. So what we're experiencing now is that COVID is impacting pretty much every domain of our lives. It's impacting our work, our social lives, our family relationships. It's certainly impacted our faith lives, but even other ways that we express ourselves in our hobbies, in our social activities, in the way that we even move about our day. And this level of impact, chronic stress in all of these domains, is having a huge impact on our mental health. There are kind of 3 main things that stand out to me when I think about what I'm seeing clinically. The first one is that chronic stress piece, and it looks like a variety of things. So it can look like explicitly feeling stressed, feeling overwhelmed, feeling on edge. It also looks very physical, so it can look like physical tension, feel like GI issues, feeling like you're having racing thoughts. It also looks like irritability, having a short fuse, a short temper. But kind of interiorly, it can look like feelings of helplessness, having gone through this for so long, really struggling to feel like you're able to handle it. And that can even take the form of self-criticism. I should be able to be on it. I should be accomplishing my COVID goals. Another way that it shows up is difficulty concentrating, difficulty making decisions. These are all the impacts of chronic stress. Another way that manifests is coping, but coping ineffectively. So looking for ways to numb, TV, alcohol, other substances, ways to regain a sense of control that can be unhelpful, working way too much, trying to control how much you eat, other things like that are all manifestations of the impact of chronic stress. Another way that it can impact us that I'm really seeing is loneliness, isolation, a sense that you can't really have the community, have the social resources that you've had. And that takes a variety of different forms. And we are already struggling as a society with loneliness before COVID. And I think that's really become worse since COVID. But I'm also seeing social anxiety. Am I wearing my mask right? How are people perceiving me? Am I going to get in trouble? This constant worry. And I think underneath that, there's been a huge sense of loss, a huge sense of kind of grief, and maybe even a sense that that shouldn't be how we feel. But we've been cut off from so much, and our picture of our lives, the way that we see ourselves, the way we're used to functioning, has just dramatically changed. So that can look like increases in depression and anxiety and substance use. It can also lead to suicidal thoughts, into self-harming behaviors. In general, I think people are just really struggling because it's been so long and it's such an overwhelming experience.
Yeah, Dr. Helena, that's great. Colleen, we're going to turn to you. Colleen, how do you see your faith life intertwined with your mental health? And can you share a little bit about what you have learned in your journey?
Sure. Yeah. So I think personally, just for me, what I've learned with mental health and my faith life is that mental health is so bound up with holiness. So what I mean by that is just that our minds and our bodies and our souls are gifts given to us by God. And so it's really up to us to be good stewards of those gifts. So I just know personally in my own life, I'm a survivor of sexual assault. And so I've been going to therapy for quite a long time. And something that I've really experienced is just doing this hard work for many years of just working through a lot of the experiences that I've had, and also just the symptoms that come with surviving trauma. So just in doing the work of, combating triggers or understanding when, I might not be trusting someone, and how that kind of relates to my background and trauma. And just really all these things, like I think any survivor would tell you that they don't really go away, but you learn in therapy how to cope with them. And so really therapy, and just like my mental health journey in general, has really taught me that the more that I do that really hard work, the more I am free and liberated to give a generous gift of myself to my relationship, to my friendships, to my job, to my studies, really everything. And so I think that's really just kind of like the main thing that I've learned, is that really mental health is so bound up in holiness. And it's not so much that, if something happens to us, something traumatic, that we become unholy. No, we just, when we engage our mental health, we really learn that we are, being good stewards of these gifts that God has given us, and that we learn that we can become free from that hold that trauma has on us, and we can really, be liberated in engaging that hard work of going through therapy and taking care of our mental health.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Colleen. Father Nick, can you tell us a little bit from your perspective how our emotional and spiritual well-being is interconnected, and what have you learned in your mental health journey?
So one of the, being a religious, we have I'm fortunate to have a lot of time to pray, and as friars, we have a bit of time for meditation. So it's interesting how we can't really, control. When I sit down to meditate, I might want to think or pray about one thing, and God might kind of shift me in another way. And I think it's interesting how that can, the prayer can really influence what we're doing. Kind of like Colleen was saying about our holiness. Certainly prayer is about that, but then it can lead to questions when we think about it, and things like the examination of conscience. There's something, reflecting on the day, and that can be more or not focused on sin, but I think it can also be focused on, like, I did that. I don't feel good about what I did today, and that's that's a sin thing. But I think there's a feeling thing too, and when we can see patterns and whatnot, establish patterns, and recognize, like, I keep doing this and I'm not quite sure why. There's usually something behind that. For my own kind of mental health journey, I was fortunate I'm an only child. So it was just me growing up. So I was very independent, and I thought I could tackle everything by myself. And it was after I entered religious life, and about 3 or 4 years in, I found out my aunt committed suicide. We knew she had some difficulties, some mental health things. And I was just, it was the first time I ever felt completely helpless and really unable to just talk about it. So the other friars, I was a student in formation, they recommended I went to counseling, and I was able to learn how to grieve. It was really the first loss, a death, especially a tragic death of someone close to me. And I was able to learn how to grieve that. And after about 2 or 3, maybe 4 visits with the counselor, I realized that there's some other stuff going on. I think that's one of the, I'm a priest, I'm not a counselor, but I think one of the key things to remember is, more often than not, the presenting issue isn't necessarily like the core or the deepest issue. When my aunt committed suicide, I was pretty angry that she did it, and I felt helpless and whatnot. And I, through counseling, I'm like, oh, I was an only child. There was some times I was kind of helpless there too. So I think making those connections, and I'm 36 now, but realizing whatever happened to me when I was 5 and 6 can influence me now. And that's not, it's not a defect. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's really about growing. I don't necessarily say maturity, because it doesn't, not to say that we're immature, but there can be this really deepening of understanding of ourselves. Like anything else, we can, the more time, more effort we spend on looking at something or learning something, well, I think that's true for ourselves. And that with that, there's a lot of messages out there, like take care of yourself, which means have a nice coffee or sleep in or do stuff. And that's nice and good, but it doesn't necessarily get to the core of the issues that are going on. Yeah.
That's great. And thank you so much, Father Nick, for sharing that with us. I want to talk a little bit about the stigma that's associated with mental illness, and particularly with seeking help. Dr. Helena, there's a misconception that people don't need a therapist or to seek help because nothing necessarily traumatic has happened. There wasn't one event or nothing really bad has happened in their life. And that someone else has it much worse and they just need to deal with it or figure it out. What would you say to someone who's struggling with these kinds of thoughts?
Yeah, this is something I see a lot, and I think is a very common struggle. And it's hard to gauge, right? It's hard to gauge inside, when do I need help? When can I just do this on my own? When I hear those kind of phrases, as a clinician especially, my immediate kind of response is a sense of, I think this is a sign you're already at or over capacity. Like when you're starting to think to yourself and talk to yourself about like, grin and bear it, white knuckle my way through, or somebody has it worse, therefore my stuff doesn't matter. You're kind of holding on, but maybe barely. And so you're using these comparative and kind of negative strategies to just hold it together. So my thought is, if you're in this domain, you probably are struggling. It's because something isn't working out well. The other thing that I can kind of say to people is kind of just directly to borrow from our title, it's okay to not be okay. I think that sometimes we just have to acknowledge that we're not okay. And it's more than that, I would add, it's okay to not know why you're not okay. And you don't have to justify it. If you're not okay, you're not okay. And I think we get into this trap of comparing suffering. You know, if my suffering is less than someone else's, that means that there's nothing to it anymore. Suffering doesn't work that way. It's not something that cancels out. It's not like math where 2 negatives equal positive, whatever it is. Suffering is suffering. 2 people can suffer at the same time, and both people's suffering deserve attention. So when you're feeling that way, when you're struggling, even if you don't know why, even if you felt like you had a great family, which you may have, even if you feel like you've never gone through any significant, you can still need help. You still deserve help. So what I like to say to everybody, my kind of workaround other message is, I really believe that good therapy can help anyone, and it's worth a shot. Come in, talk to somebody, and see how they can help you. Maybe it's just a few sessions, problem solve, get you back on track, help you figure out what was going on wrong, and then you can figure out how to fix it. But why not take the shot? Like, we're called to carry these crosses. We're called into a life of suffering, into union with Christ through that suffering. But I think sometimes we forget that one of the most immediate ways that we can carry our cross is by asking for help, and is acknowledging that this is hard and we need to ask for Christ's help, but we also need to ask for each other's help and even a therapist's help.
Yeah, Dr. Helena, that's so beautiful. Father Nick, I also want to talk a little bit about, we know that there's a lot of stigma surrounding mental health and seeking help, and at times that stigma is even greater for men. Why do you think that is, and what advice would you give to young men who are struggling and not sure what to do about it?
Why do I think that is? I was teaching high school. It was all boys high school. It was in Baltimore and in Buffalo, and I mostly taught the seniors. And it's funny what they can be vulnerable about. They're spending a lot of time with each other, and they share all these things, but a lot of times they don't want to share weakness. And we talk about that vulnerability. And a lot of times, those situations, they'll be, I assume, afraid that they'll be made fun of, and then they'll come talk to me after school and they'll be crying, and it's like, oh, something's going on here. And I think that sense of bottling it up is really what can be detrimental. So I think of my students thought I was like Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec, and they're like, there's only 2 times it's okay to cry: at funerals and the Grand Canyon. I'm like, that's silly. If they don't a lot of these guys don't have necessarily a role model about what it means to be a man, and still be emotive, and it's okay to cry, and it's okay to have weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and a lot of it comes from family, but unless they have a good example of that, to really of vulnerability, with healthy boundaries, with hitting kind of the points and the aspects of their spiritual and their mental health life that they need to, they'll kind of be, I think, kind of caged in that. And it's tough to go out of that, because oftentimes they have to do that by themselves. One of the benefits of religious life is that I'm usually living with 10, 12 other guys, and particularly when I was in formation, and now what I do as the formator, we call each other out on things, if they're doing something bad or dumb, but also it's like, hey, you seem kind of down today, like what's going on? So I think that that sense of community that I have in a religious life, sometimes people have that in families, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have that with friends, sometimes they don't. I think particularly during COVID, and you're just not seeing people face to face. You can see people on Zoom, and that's good, but you don't necessarily ask the same kind of questions as if you were face to face. So again, kind of like Dr. Helena was just saying, like, just try it. Like, really, what do you have to lose? And if you think that, like, I think I should go to counseling, like, do it. That's like, just don't try to figure it out. Don't just try it. I think that's a sign that something's going on, and no which way, shape, or form does that mean you're broke or you're any less than anyone else. A lot of us go to counseling, and it's a good thing that can make us more whole, and that's a good thing. So
I love that imagery. Colleen, I've experienced, and I know many others have experienced, a lot of shame and misinformation and poor guidance in our Catholic parishes and communities about how to support those who are struggling with mental illness. In your experience, where have you seen positive examples of support in Catholic communities to work against the stigma of mental illness? And what practically could parishes or Catholic communities do to support those who are struggling?
That's a great question. I think, unfortunately, just in the Catholic Church right now, we are learning more about this conversation of mental health. I don't think we're there yet for sure. And I think the reason of why that is just because if, we are pastoral ministers or people come to us in the parish or we're theology teachers or what have you, we want to attend to the problem in front of us with what we know. And so if we're trained to be a theology teacher, if we're trained to be a pastoral minister, we might have the temptation to spiritualize the problem that's in front of us. And so if someone comes to us with a real mental health problem or something that really should be taken to counseling or to a therapist, that's important for us to be able to recognize. So I would say, just right off the bat, we're not where we need to be as far as that conversation. Where I have seen this done well is just really Catholic colleges. I think that universities are such a great place where, you can be introduced to therapy and counseling if you've never experienced before. I know just as a doctoral student, I've had fantastic experience with the Catholic University Counseling Center. They do an excellent job there. But I think just really what's so important about that is that the Counseling Center makes it very known what services they have and very known that this is something that should be talked about, especially for young adults or college students. And so I think really our parishes and other Catholic communities can take a cue from them because just as kind of we've mentioned several different times, it's so important just to have this conversation. And so if Catholic communities can just even start by having a speaker come and talk about mental health, or if we're talking about catechesis in the parish, are we talking about mental health at all stages of the person's life that we're catechizing them? Are we talking to them even when they're very little about the kind of the importance of our emotions and the importance of paying attention to them? And are we talking to adults going through marriage preparation or joining the church about the importance of mental health integrated with a spiritual life? So I think just first, that would be what I would say is, just to have the conversation, look for ways and places to just talk about it like we're doing here. But also I think something that individually Catholics can do is if you're comfortable telling your story about mental health, just do it, normalize it. If you're comfortable telling your story, I think 9 times out of 10, if you tell your story to somebody else and they're struggling, they're going to be emboldened to seek help too. If you've been able to, go get help and go seek therapy, and you can tell someone about that, I think that just even in a very small way starts to normalize getting help and going to therapy in the church, which I think is just a hugely important thing to just keep talking about and keep growing in our ability as a church to have this conversation.
Yeah, Colleen, that's fantastic. Father Nick, I know we kind of have talked a bit around our emotional and spiritual lives and how they're connected, but I want to talk a little more about seeking counseling versus seeking spiritual direction. When do you know if you need to seek mental health counseling or spiritual direction? How are they similar? How are they different? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that's a tough one. I just being Franciscan, we started 800 years ago, and a lot of the patristics, church fathers too, and church mothers too. There's actually a lot of beautiful women writing about spiritual things in the medieval times. They didn't have language of counseling or mental health. So much of it was kind of couched kind of in this spiritual aspect. So I think it's they certainly have a lot of wisdom about that. So the two, at least within the tradition, kind of came up together, but it's always been spiritual direction really before counseling. Nowadays, I think it can be really difficult to find a spiritual director, or at least it's much easier to find a counselor than a spiritual director. It's just not something that's out there like it used to be. And you can look up kind of in the phone book, people don't have phone books. You can look up kind of more easily a counselor, and then you kind of spiritual director. So I think that's a reality we need to be aware of. Concerning seeking help, there's time I do spiritual direction for people, and a lot of mental health things come up. And I have to be real honest. Like if somebody says something like I really don't, it's tough to give examples, but I can tell when some things, like if it's something with depression or anxiety, it's not as simple as just praying it away or just turning to God, or there can be some very deep things spiritually going on, but also really mentally as well. And I think there's no set of questions that we can ask, or online quiz we can just take to go to one or the other. But if you think something spiritual, talk to somebody spiritual about that. If you think it's a mental health thing, talk to a mental health counselor about that. Again, the two are really, really interrelated. Lately, I've been reading St. John of the Cross, and he's known for Dark Night of the Soul, but he actually wrote this other book before that, and it's called the Ascent to Mount Carmel. So there's a couple different people who had saints who wrote about kind of this ascending to God. But a lot of the times, because God is up, we have to ascend. A lot of times, St. Bonaventure does this too, talks more about we need to go deeper inside ourselves. God made us, we're made in the image and likeness of God. Our soul is something precious and good, and that a lot of the times going in deeper is the answer, but we kind of need people to help us navigate these things, that we don't want to do these things by ourselves. And the other kind of image with that is that I'll use St. Bonaventure. He talks about kind of the spiral. It's not just this linear thing or zero-sum thing. It's not like, okay, we're good or bad, or oftentimes St. Bonaventure says we have to purgation, realize what's going on. We need to illuminate it, just shed the light of Christ on it, and then through that we hit a unity. But as soon as we kind of hit unity, we're at a new place, and we need to do that purgation again. So it's much more of a spiral, insofar as I think this is true for prayer, but certainly for mental health things, that we'll look over the same things kind of over and over and over again. But that's good, because we're seeing it in a new light, and that when we better understand prayer, we can better understand our mental health. When we better understand our mental health, we can better understand our prayer, and those two certainly go together and certainly complement each other. So it's difficult to make a really clear distinction between the two, but an honest counselor and an honest spiritual director should be able to tell you, I can't help you with that one. You go see somebody else.
Yeah. I'm thinking of a priest friend of mine who I had a conversation with once, and he said, most of the time when people came to me for spiritual direction, it was really because they needed to also seek therapy at the same time. And a lot of times it was him that said, I'm so willing to walk with you in this journey, but we have to do this alongside therapy. And, even in my own experience, there was a time where I was in both therapy and spiritual direction at the same time. I was grieving a tragic loss of a loved one. So there's a lot of grief in there, but there was also this kind of anger that was starting to come up in my prayer life, and questioning of why, God, why is this happening? So I think, Father Nick, what you said is a perfect example of a lot of times, these coincide and these come together. But that it is important to figure out and to know that you might need kind of both guides, which leads us a little bit to our next question for Colleen. Colleen, you've had experiences with both Catholic and non-Catholic therapists. How important is it for you to have a Catholic therapist? And can you talk about that a little bit?
So I think a few years ago, I would have answered this question a lot differently. So no, it's not actually very important for me to have a Catholic therapist. As I mentioned before, when I first started at CUA as a doctoral student, they have this really great thing that they do. They give you basically a full year of counseling sessions for free through the University Counseling Center. And so when I enrolled in that, I was matched up with a therapist, and I didn't really have a choice in who I got to pick. And so I met with this therapist, Laura, and over like a couple of months, I learned that she was Jewish, and which was just such a gift, because I had really only had a Catholic therapist and then a Christian, like an evangelical therapist before. And so it was really neat. But it's really been such a gift, because I think, as just in my introduction, probably most people are aware, my life is like just really Catholic. So like my job is so Catholic. I work for a Catholic organization, and then I study catechesis and Catholic theology. And so it's really important for me personally to have that space in therapy where I don't have to feel like I'm being professional, but I can just be authentically myself. And it's just been such a gift to have Laura, my therapist. I continue to see her, and I just absolutely adore her. She's just been such an important part of my healing journey. And I think too, so I'm writing my dissertation on accompaniment and Pope Francis' understanding of accompaniment. And when I think of accompaniment, I really do think about my relationship with my therapist, Laura, because although she's Jewish and I'm Catholic, she's a very good therapist. So she's not trying to impose her views on me, and I'm not trying to, impose any of my views on her. It's just this relationship of really walking together, where she's supporting me and witnessing to my healing. And so I just think that's so important to remember, that a good therapist is not going to try to impose their views on you, and they're also not going to try to like disparage your views. They're always going to respect that. And then I just know too, that's so true in my relationship with my therapist, and also just what I've read about it just in general, is that for healing in therapy, it's so important, the bond between the therapist and the client. And so I think that just this question of like, is it really important to have a Catholic therapist, really relates to that, because if you have a great bond with a non-Catholic therapist, then like that's going to make all the difference in your healing process. So, stick with a person that you have a great bond with. And like, I'm just so grateful for my therapist, Laura, because like I said, it's just been a really beautiful experience of accompaniment, and just a really important aspect of my healing to have her in my life.
Great. Dr. Helena, for many people, finding a therapist for the first time can be an intimidating experience, especially if you're struggling and you're not sure whether to do it. It can seem like just this other task to figure out and research. Could you talk a little about how to look for a therapist for the first time? How does this all work?
Sure, it's definitely complicated, but I do think that like overall it just takes a little bit of making it a priority and persevering in the process. So practically speaking, what do? You probably do the things that come naturally to your mind. People usually find a therapist through one of two ways: either the direct recommendation of someone they know. So someone, for example, like you said, Laura, she sounds great, so I'd ask you for more information. And that, I think, is very often how people find good therapists. You trust someone that you see is growing and is healing, and so you ask to work with their therapist. The other, much more common way, Google. That's how we find everything these days. That's how you find a therapist. There are a couple websites that you can use. The main one that I often send people to is called psychologytoday.com. And the kind of Catholic equivalent is called catholictherapists.com. And they're search engines. So you can look by location, look by specialization, anxiety, depression, look up by fee, by insurance, things like that. If you do have insurance, you're going to want to look and see if you have behavioral health coverage. That's what covers mental health care. And my caveat on all insurance based searches is find someone through the directory, find someone that you like, find someone who describes themselves in a way that is consistent with what you're hoping to get, but call your insurance company and verify through them that this therapist is covered. You want it to be on the phone because the directory can be off. So what do you do from there? Let's say you found someone, it's a good fit, a good enough fit. You have to give them a call. And usually there's a couple different ways that you can do it, but I'll tell you a little bit about our process at the IPS Center. We set up what's called a phone screening, which is just a conversation. And that allows us to get a little bit of a sense of who you are, what you're struggling with, a little bit of your history. And then we do the same. We share who we are, what we do, and how we can be helpful. And why we do that is because we think it's really important that there be a mutual decision point, that we get a sense of who you are and we make sure that this is something within our wheelhouse, something we can be helpful for you with, but also you deserve that. You deserve that moment to kind of get a sense of what it might look like to come in. And so then we kind of decide together in that piece. Some clinicians don't do it over the phone. They just wait till the first appointment and you do it together at that point. But we find that it's helpful to do it over the phone. So that's our process. One kind of modification that I would add in COVID times is most people, myself included, are doing telehealth pretty exclusively as clinicians. So there's going to be a conversation about that. One of the more complicated factors in the DMV is, for example, I'm not licensed in DC. I'm licensed in Virginia. So I'm only allowed to work with someone who's physically located in Virginia when we're on a call. So I recommend that you look based on where your location is when you anticipate being on the call, because that will really make a determination about who can work with you.
That's very helpful, Dr. Helena. And maybe we can get to this a little later if we have some time, but I'd also love to talk a little bit about if you have to stay with that first therapist that you ever meet, and can you ever switch therapists and in that process. But let's jump into some of the questions that we had sent in from young adults. Father Nick, you're up first. We have a question from Bree. So I know for many young adults, their 20s and 30s is a time of deep self-reflection and trying to discover their authentic self. Bree has a question about how to manage striving to live an authentic and meaningful life while also getting caught up in the vanity or highlight reel of social media. So here's our question. Social media has been really hard on my mental health, both before and during the pandemic. How do you balance the desire to be connected with friends and family on social media, especially during a time of physical isolation and separation, with the very real negative mental health consequences of being consumed in the social media world?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I remember a couple of years ago, I gave up. So I'll just talk about Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, because I think those are the main ones. And I was having a lot of Instagram. I like backpacking and camping and traveling. And even a couple of years ago, I just don't get a lot of time to do that. And I was following more and more Instagram accounts thinking, oh, maybe this will kind of satisfy that need. And it really did the opposite. It created this really fear of missing out. And then I was getting angry that I wasn't getting enough time off. So it was actually one Lent I gave up Instagram and I just cut it out completely. And that was one of the best things that I did for my mental health at that point in time. And that was kind of easier in one sense, because I don't think Instagram has, some people use it for more connectivity, but I use Twitter a bit, and I think that has, at least I use it as really as a social media to kind of keep up with people and have interesting conversations. And I think being really disciplined about that, and that's hard because if, with quarantine and stuff, there's a lot of time can be at home. There's pretty much no time. Before, I think there was times where it was socially unacceptable to use a phone. You're at a meeting and this and that. Now we can just do whatever we want. And that creates this opportunity for it. And we're just not seeing people like we are before. Twitter can be helpful in other mediums as well, to kind of keep in contact with people. But if it becomes this thing where we end up, for me, I was getting angry because I wasn't going camping and I was seeing people doing all these camping things. It was good for me to cancel Instagram. With all of the things on social media, I know there can be pressure to like follow people or be friends with people on Facebook, and have family things on there. But there's a lot of, you can follow people and then mute them. You are not obligated to talk to anybody on Facebook or Twitter. It's like, I don't want to mute grandma, but sometimes she's saying stuff, and it's okay in the same way in real life where you want to say, I just don't want to talk about that right now. It's okay to say. I do think there can be a lot of positive interaction, at least on Twitter. I've been using Twitter for a couple of years, like 5 or 6 now, I suppose. And I think it has been, for me personally, it's connected me with especially a lot of Catholics. It's been fruitful for me now because of quarantine and who I work with. It's the 10 student friars that live here. I'm not at a parish or at a high school, so it's nice to be able to interact with people on that. So I think it can be a good thing. But on Twitter, I often say, like, you got to make Twitter good for yourself. And there is this, once you kind of start engaging, once you start responding or liking or retweeting, it's a slippery slope. So if you're going to get into a particular conversation that's potentially divisive, be real careful about that first or second step, because you can get tied into that. Social media can be a good thing, but we really need to have some really solid boundaries with it. And like, there's Twitter timers on your phone and whatnot, or you delete the app, then you just end up going through Safari or whatever and you type in, and it's just a terrible user experience. Just, if you got to cut it out, cut it out. It's okay. If your eye's causing you to sin, pluck it out. If Twitter's causing you to sin, delete it. And just delete it for 3 days. See what happens. It doesn't have to be forever, but just give you that space. Our phones can literally be in our hands all the time. I think we need that just distance from that sometimes. So.
Yeah, Father Nick, talk about being honest. That is so great. It's also very reassuring because the mute function has been one of the best things for me in my mental health on social media. And I'm really glad to know that I'm not alone in that. So thank you for sharing that. Dr. Helena, Jay asks, he says, I've heard many people talk about hitting a wall around the 6-month mark into the pandemic. People are no longer experiencing the novelty of being home 24/7, baking bread or picking up a new skill at home to pass the time. As we enter this next phase of COVID with colder weather, less sunlight, being indoors more, and being a bit burnt out by the pandemic, what can we realistically do? How can people stay healthy in this next phase?
Such a good question. I think it's really acknowledging how so many people are feeling. It's intimidating, right? It's been a long journey. It's been such a different journey than we anticipated. We bought in for 2 weeks and then for 2 months, and I think the instability and unpredictability of it, and the idea that it could keep going, is very intimidating and is leaving us feeling like, I don't know, the baking bread resonated. The idea of like, I've tried so many things, what do I do? So first of all, I think it's just appropriate to kind of get a sense that that's normal and understandable, and not try and like fight that feeling and sort of be like, I shouldn't feel this way. It looks like baking bread is working for someone else, so maybe I'm not doing it right. But just a sense of like, yeah, this isn't working. This is exhausting. I'm stressed out because we're in a global pandemic, because there's a lot going on, and 2020 has been hard. In terms of kind of more practicals, which I know is what the question is pulling for, there's a lot, but I'm going to give kind of 2 main recommendations. What I really encourage people to do, and I actually encourage you to do this with someone else, the first piece is to reflect. take some time, and I would encourage you to do this in a conversation where someone's asking you, what went well? You did have to figure things out. You had to adjust so many different things. What adjustments worked? What didn't work? What did you try and maybe try for too long? What have you expected from yourself that you just haven't been able to achieve? So name those things, but then get specific about why. Why did that new thing work for me? What need did it address? How did it make me feel better? What thing didn't work? Why didn't it work? In that kind of reflection piece, I also think it's important to think about, like, what are your limits? Sometimes it's harder to say, like, my limit is 35 minutes on Twitter. Maybe it's really clear that that's it. But I think we know ourselves when we've passed our limits versus when we know the exact limit. So get specific about, like, what are the signs that I'm approaching a limit, and what are really the signs that I'm over a limit, where I'm too stressed out when I'm struggling with things. So take that time to reflect, because you can't build a path forward unless you have a sense of, like, what helps me get down a good path. So how do you plan? Well, I think, first of all, I think we have to kind of acknowledge and in some ways accept the fact that we need to plan for a marathon. We need to plan for a longer situation and allow ourselves some time to feel what that feels like, and to feel intimidated, but then to actually develop a plan. In that plan, I really do think that you should use some of the classic strategies. They're classics for a reason. Make sure you're getting good sleep, make sure you're finding a way to exercise, make sure that you're eating well, and doing things that you can feel proud of. Not proud of in the moment, but proud of over a longer period of time. I also think that you should find ways to build in joy. And one way that I like to put it is build in playfulness. I think that when you try and build in, like, mandated, you're going to have fun now for 20 minutes, it doesn't work. But if you find a way to play, there's such a lightness and a levity and a finding of ourselves in a new way when we play. So that often involves other people. So find a way to be playful with others. But I think that can really orient us to those activities that are really nurturing and satisfying. I also think that you should build into this plan things to look forward to, because that really helps us chunk out time and feel like we're making progress. All of this, I think you have to plan ways to connect. And I think that you can think about connecting briefly, but also think about connecting deeply. So you might want to put a buddy system into place, or an accountability person, someone that you play well with and want to kind of check in and do this silly game with, or silly challenge. That's great. But also build in someone that you can hold you accountable a little bit, like what Father was saying, of, like, you don't look good, what's going on? Or someone who says, like, I know this is a hard time for you. What's not working there? With all of this, I always caution people that you'll need to be flexible. Some days, your plan will work great and you will be like, oh my gosh, I'm on it, these things are happening. And some days your plans won't work at all. That doesn't mean that your plan is bad and needs to get scrapped, but any good plan has some give to it. So make sure there's some give in your plan. Make sure that you're kind of compassionate and understanding with yourself of when you need to flex and why. And I also think that in your plan, you should have a sense of when you might need to reach out to a therapist. When are you really past your limits? If you're feeling emotionally overwhelmed, if you're starting to have what people call darker thoughts or struggling with substances, that's a sign you need to talk to somebody. And that can be in your plan.
That's all great advice. Colleen, we're going to go to you. Meredith says, sometimes we see mental health struggles in our family or friends. What have you seen as helpful or unhelpful when talking with friends or family?
That's a great question. So I think that just first of all, just kind of on the note that Dr. Helena was talking about reflection, to just kind of stop and reflect, like, what am I trying to get out of this conversation with my family or my friend? Is it to share how I'm doing? Is it to ask for support? Is it to ask them if they're okay? So kind of just first, like, understanding what you want out of that conversation, and kind of like from there, like, making a plan as to maybe some ideas for how to go about that conversation. But I think one thing that I know in my experience that has been important for me to both, like, just remember, and also to caution others about, is that just to be aware that other people are at different places with understanding mental health. So for example, your parents might not be the same mind where it's like an open conversation like we're having here. I think for like millennials and younger generations, that it's just kind of a more open conversation. I know we all share memes on Instagram, and like we make light of our traumas, and we make light of, you know, like our depression and everything. And so I think that's a sign that, like, you know, our generation, it's becoming a little bit more of an open conversation. But at the same time, to just remember that people are on different pages with that, and that's okay. So just to, you know, recognize that people are human, and to kind of check our expectations if we want a certain way of being supported, to make sure that we communicate that to somebody else and not have these kind of like expectations in our head that we don't share, and then we get resentful when someone is not able to meet those expectations. But as far as just, I think conversations about checking in with friends, I know that just kind of with my really close friends, that it's become a really helpful thing to just occasionally check in on each other during the pandemic. And so if you want to check in on your friends and make sure they're doing okay, you have an excuse now because of the pandemic. So to just like check in and say like, hey, how are you doing with everything? I think that's a really great way to kind of both strengthen your friendship, but also, you know, make sure your friends are okay and to take care of them. But I think there's just, it's easy to overthink those conversations when we can just kind of like reach out and do it. But yeah, I think those are some of the things that I would just say to remember in those conversations.
Great. I do want to kind of go back really quickly, and Dr. Helena, we don't have to talk too long about it, but in terms of like finding a therapist, someone who I know who's very close to me went to try to therapy, and the therapist just wasn't a good fit, and she felt really kind of not great about the whole experience. Can you talk a little about, do you have to stay with the first therapist you go to? You know, what would you recommend if it's not a good fit the first time?
That's such a good question. And I agree. I don't think that we talk about that. I think Colleen really nailed it earlier in talking about like the relationship, how central that is to therapy being effective. Feeling like you can be vulnerable with this person. Do they really hear you? Do you have a sense that they can be helpful? These are really valuable internal gauges, right? If you're sitting with someone and you have a sense that like you just start getting more and more off put, you start to feel more and more anxious, listen to those signs, listen to those cues. Be curious about them. See, might it be something else? Might it be that I don't want to acknowledge that I'm really struggling? Might it be that I don't want to stop doing X, Y, or Z? Or might it be that this person and I don't have a connection? Or worse, that I feel judged, that I feel really off put by this person. Those are valuable things to make sense of. You can definitely go see one therapist and then go see a different one. But it's going to be a balance. It's going to be a balance of no therapist is a perfect fit. I'm not a perfect fit for the clients that I work with. But it is a balance of, do I think it's good enough? Do I feel safe enough? And do I have a sense that I could become safer here? That we could build something. We both have to put effort into building something that can hold the work that I need to do. Or do I have a sense that, no, that might not work? Those are, I think it's a discernment process and something that you get to take time in. But there isn't like a way, we don't lock you in, you aren't stuck with us. And so I do think that it's giving yourself almost the permission to give it a shot and let it go. And that's actually something you can say at the first meeting of just saying, yeah, I have things that are bringing me in, but I'm not sure if here's the right place. If you can help me decide that, make it an open conversation. We're used to talking about that, so we won't be surprised or horrified or off put. I'll love the frankness of it, but great, let's do it. So I think it's always on the table. Give it to yourself as a possibility, but really reflect and think like, what is it that's pushing me away? Is it the clinician? Is it something in me? How do I want to go about working on that?
Awesome. All right, Father Nick, I'm going to toss you our last question for the night. So post-election, a lot of people are feeling really divided right now. And as we're getting ready to celebrate Thanksgiving and Christmas, which in a non-pandemic year, in a non-election year, can be really difficult for people. But 2020 just keeps giving us some really tough stuff to deal with. As some people might be gathering with family for Thanksgiving, for Christmas or holidays, what are some good tips that you have to not fall into those traps that would negatively impact our mental health?
I might not be the best person to ask for this because I spend a lot of time with the friars, and I'm not going I haven't gone, home for Christmas or Thanksgiving for 14, 15 years. So it's really easy for me to say these things, but I think doing them is another thing. But a couple things, I'll just kind of put them out there. Not having like any expectations, just being open to what happens. Saying if somebody tries to engage you in something and you don't want to talk about it, it's like, I really don't want to talk about them. So, I'm sorry. It's perfectly good, a reasonable thing to say. Sometimes we'll overhear other people saying things. We don't have to, we can think they're wrong or bad or whatever. We don't have to respond to them and whatnot. If it's possible, having some sort of exit strategy, whether it's like, it's not, I got, something's going on tomorrow. To not make, to not lie about it. It's like, it's okay. I'm kind of tired. I'm going to go home now. It's an okay thing to say. So I think being honest about that, and also kind of sort of preparing. Again, I've been home for Christmas a handful of times in the past 14, 15 years. And I don't know if this is true for other people, but I generally know what kind of things are going to come up. And when my saintly Aunt Rose, who's 95, starts, spouting political things and whatnot, it's like, okay, Aunt Rose, she's harmless and she means well, and that's Aunt Rose. And that can be kind of an easier thing to, or easier person to deal with. It's a little bit harder when it's a cousin or it's an uncle or somebody that you're not necessarily more closely with, but just a little bit more closely with an age, or somebody who is a little bit more kind of in tune with these things. And also to just pray, like it sounds maybe silly, or like we pray about it, like, and to like prepare yourself, like even if it's in a week. Even when I go home to Buffalo, there's just some things that kind of trigger me, like where I've left my grandparents, their house is still there. When I drive by it, it makes me think, and nothing bad happened there. I had really beautiful experiences, but I miss them in a way. But I think when, particularly with just a more mobile society, when we go home, and especially if it's like the family home, that can bring up stuff. So I think preparing, but really also just praying about it. And it can be difficult. Again, with the friars, we spend a lot, none of us are going anywhere. A lot of times they're like, what were you up to today? Like school, okay. But I think to be creative about having conversations about things, to like prepare again for conversations. What books have you been reading? Just even if it's just football, it doesn't have to be super deep conversation, but making some sort of connection with other people at that level that you kind of feel like you can make it at that time. I like football. It's not my favorite thing in the world. My dad watches a heck of a lot of it, and I try to watch a little bit so that I can talk to my dad about it. That he's retired. That's really what he loves. So I do about that, and he's starting to talk about things that I love too. It takes that time, but I think there's less things to talk about. We need to do more to find those common things that we can talk about. So
I love it. Finding different ways to connect that aren't necessarily too difficult to connect on. I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight for Theology on Tap. Tonight's conversation is recorded and it will be posted later on our webpage and on our social medias. I just want to say thank you to our panel, Colleen, Father Nick, Dr. Helena. You all are outstanding, and I have just really enjoyed this conversation with you all tonight. I also want to thank Christina DeSalvo for providing tonight's ASL interpretation. To learn more about outreach to young Catholics in DC, including a listing of small group Bible studies and book clubs for young Catholics, please visit dccatholic.org or text DC Catholic to 84576. Thank you all for being here, and good night and God bless.